Introduction to Philosophy, Lecture 21, on the Illusion of Free Will. This chapter of our text gives us a selection from Baron Dolbach's work entitled Good Sense. The arguments presented here are less dependent on the laws of physics than those of our previous discussion, and more dependent on analysis of human psychology and the implications of religious beliefs. In the first two paragraphs, there is a sense that he is taking direct aim at Christianity, as though his aim is to attack it specifically, but he could just be using it as a familiar example to prove his point regarding determinism. In the first sentence, he asserts that religious teachings are contradictory in their ascription of free will to humans because other aspects of the teachings seem to restrict free will. He further seems to accuse theologians of inadvertently demonizing God in their attempts to prove his existence or explain his nature. He argues that if a person is born without grace, then they will be necessitated to do evil. He goes on to describe the situation as God punishing that person because God didn't give that person grace. So he is claiming that God punishes people for being how he made them to be. In the second paragraph, he claims that it is easy to recognize the contradiction in theological systems, that people are both claimed to be free but cannot be, given the other details of those systems. He points out that it is not up to us whether we are born or who we are born to. We don't have a choice in who our parents are or what ideas we get from them or from our teachers. We also don't have a choice in where we are born, and dependent on that, we may become drastically different people. If we are born somewhere without access to religion or education, we will develop drastically different worldviews. This is something that is sometimes referred to as moral luck. Depending on when and where we're born, we may be lucky or unlucky. A person born in 1920s Germany may have the misfortune of becoming a Nazi in 1939, but that same person, born in a different country, may be lucky enough to live a peaceful and virtuous life. The example given in our text is being born somewhere that Christianity is unknown, and being damned because we had no way of knowing about Christianity. In the next section, Dolbach continues to advance his argument that human freedom is either extremely limited or non-existent. He suggests that external forces and circumstances significantly influence people's actions and choices throughout their lives. He argues that various factors such as birth, upbringing, education, temperament, and environment and circumstances influence a person's thoughts, desires, and actions and limit their freedom. He starts this section by pointing out that a person's birth is not a choice they make, but rather circumstances that happen to them without their consent. Repetitively, they do not get to choose their country of birth or their parents. Similarly, he argues that a person's ideas, opinions, and notions, whether true or false, are shaped by the education they receive, which is not under their control. He also suggests that a person's passions, desires, and temperament are inherent traits determined by nature, not by our own will. Throughout a person's life, their actions are influenced by a multitude of factors, such as their connections, occupations, pleasures, and even conversations. Of course, these days we could include media in that list. The text argues further that people's thoughts are involuntarily presented to their minds and that they cannot foresee or prevent many events or accidents that impact their choices and actions. He further suggests that a person's will or desires are not entirely free, but are constrained by what they perceive as advantageous to themselves. Even in cases where a person may appear to choose pain over pleasure, he argues that the choice is ultimately driven by the prospect of greater long-term benefit. In the next section, he argues that human beings do not have full control over their mental states and actions, and that external factors determine their choices. He suggests that resistance to desires is not necessarily a sign of freedom, but rather the result of the balance of motives. He starts by discussing the idea that human beings do not have complete control over their emotions, desires, and actions, and their choices are influenced by factors such as love, imagination, temperament, and other motives. He argues that, in the case of romantic love, a person doesn't have control over the features or qualities that attract them to their partner. They do not have control over their feelings of love or the object of their affection, which makes sense because many people report trying to change what or who they find attractive and fail to do so. Some organizations even try to change people's sexuality with so-called conversion therapy, which has been shown to be ineffective and even harmful. He further suggests that a person's imagination and temperament, which shape their desires, are not fully under their control, implying that they are not completely free in their emotional responses. Dolbach goes on to say that resistance to desires is not necessarily a sign of freedom, but rather a result of the balance of their motivations. When a person resists their desires, it is because other motives, such as fear of dishonor or punishment, are stronger than the desires they are resisting. The implication is that this resistance is not truly voluntary or free, but rather the result of external factors determining our choices. In the next section, he challenges our notion that deliberation is a sign of freedom and argues that our judgments and decision-making processes are influenced by external factors, which limit our freedom of choice. It questions our control over knowing or not knowing and suggests that our certainty or uncertainty is not entirely within our grasp. He begins by discussing the concept of deliberation. Deliberation, which is a process of considering and weighing different options before making a decision, is a necessary effect of uncertainty regarding the consequences of our actions. So when we come to conclusions, though we think we arrived at them freely, we are necessitated by the content of our deliberations. In other words, Dolbach is arguing that our judgments, whether true or false, are not free, but rather determined by the ideas that we have received or formed in our minds. This implies that our decision-making processes are influenced by external factors, such as the information we have been exposed to or our preconceived notions, which limit our freedom to make truly independent choices. He questions whether we are ever truly certain of what we know or do not know, of what we can be certain or uncertain. He suggests that our certainty or uncertainty is a result of various influences that shape our judgments. In the next section, he challenges the notion of freedom in people's choices, arguing that external factors such as judgments, reasoning ability, and inherent nature play a significant role in shaping decisions, and that true freedom may be more complex than it initially appears. He begins by arguing that people are necessitated to choose what they judge to be the most useful or agreeable. Even when people suspend their choice, they are forced to do so until they gather enough information about the qualities of the objects presented to them or weigh the consequences of their actions. Dolbach further challenges the notion that actions such as suicide or decisions that are detrimental to oneself are proof of freedom. He argues that a person's ability to reason well or poorly depends on the opinions he has formed or the inherent nature of his being, and not on his will, thus indicating that reason and wisdom are not necessarily indicative of freedom. Here our text can be easily misinterpreted. People often confuse phrases like incorrect reasoning to refer to specific conclusions. However, this is not the case. This objection comes from a position of logical inexperience. Correct reasoning means that the conclusion, regardless of what that conclusion may be, was arrived at logically. So, to ask if someone reasoned correctly, it isn't a matter of preference or opinion, it is a matter of arriving at a conclusion without committing a logical fallacy. Again, it doesn't matter what a person believes. What matters for their reasoning to be correct is that they arrived at that conclusion logically. As a philosopher, scientist, or any other type of intellectual, it is our command of logic that determines the quality of our reasoning abilities. Dolbach also questions the idea of freedom in the context of making a wager. He suggests that even in cases where one may argue that they are free to choose due to the desire to win or lose a wager, the underlying motives and desires, whether it be to win the wager or to prove a point, ultimately determine the decision, making it not truly free. This part of his argument is more important than may be obvious. Dolbach is counting on us being philosophers, that is, people who are legitimately considering the arguments he is presenting. The wager argument is an example of someone who is merely being contrary. By ignoring the actual argument, just being contrary requires less thought and more explanation and argumentation than would be needed if we took the argument seriously in the first place, as we should as philosophers and intellectuals. We are wasting the arguer's time, since if we had done our due diligence to fully understand the argument, we wouldn't need all the extra grief on the part of our generous interlocutors. This is a trap that a lot of students fall into or push themselves into, making it more difficult to understand conclusions that they would otherwise come to understand more easily if they had had more open minds to begin with. As a student, I was guilty of this myself, but fortunately, I had some very patient instructors. Despite my dismissiveness of things like determinism as alternatives or threats to free will, they calmly explained everything as simply as I needed it to be, and eventually I came to understand. But if I had approached the material with an open mind from the beginning, I could have saved us all a lot of grief and a lot of time. In the next section, he argues that the feeling of freedom is illusory, as our actions are determined by our volitions and desires, which are influenced by external factors beyond our control. It challenges the notion of true freedom and suggests that our beliefs in freedom may be misguided. Like our previous discussions of determinism, Dolbach describes the feeling of freedom as an illusion, likening it to a fly that thinks it has control over the direction of a carriage that it's riding on. It suggests that people's beliefs in their own freedom is akin to this illusion, as we may feel like we have the power to manipulate the world, while in reality, we are unknowingly carried along by external forces. Dolbach further asserts that the inward persuasion of freedom, the belief that we can choose to do something or not to do something, is also an illusion. He posits that our actions are always necessary consequences of our volitions and desires, which are not within our control. In the next section, he entertains objections to the legitimacy of ascribing moral blame and criminal punishments in a deterministic world. He argues that society's punishment of criminals is driven by a desire for self-preservation, and likens it to the natural instincts to avoid harm. He argues that if individuals act necessarily according to their impulses and nature, it is not necessarily unjust to punish them for the actions that they couldn't avoid. Society's self-preservation driven punishment of criminals is similar to how objects that necessarily produce pain in us and our nature forces us to avoid them. Society's punishment of criminals is seen as a necessary response to protect itself from potential harm or danger posed by those who have committed crimes. The example given in our text is of a hungry tiger that springs upon a man to devour him. The man's fear and subsequent actions to defend himself against the tiger are thought not to be under his control, but rather as necessary responses dictated by his nature. In the next section, he argues that mistaken beliefs are necessary consequences of ignorance and other factors, and that truth, experience, reflection, and reason are remedies for curing these errors. However, the effectiveness of these remedies depends on the receptivity of individuals to truth and their willingness to seek it sincerely. The argument continues that, from a deterministic worldview, where everything is seen as necessary, these errors are necessary consequences of ignorance, inexperience, negligence, and lack of reflection. He suggests that truth, experience, reflection, and reason are remedies that can cure ignorance, fanaticism, and follies. However, Dolbach acknowledges that not everyone is receptive to truth and its effects. Some diseases of the mind, such as obstinacy, self-interest, and folly, can resist the remedies of truth. He further argues that the cause can only produce its effect when its action is not interrupted by stronger causes. In other words, truth can only have its intended effect on those who are open to it and sincerely seek it. Self-interest and prejudice are the types of things that can interrupt truth. So he is implying that honest minds who are willing to seek truth sincerely will be receptive to truth, while those who resist the truth due to their interests or prejudices or biases will not be easily convinced. In the next section, he rejects the notion that depriving humans of free will, and thereby reducing them to mere machines, disqualifies them from ascription of traditional concepts of merit and virtue. He argues that individuals, regardless of how they are perceived, can still contribute positively or negatively to society based on their actions, and society rewards and punishes them accordingly. Dolbach suggests that machines or automatons, capable of producing desirable effects, should not be considered contemptible. He gives an example of Marcus Aurelius, who was useful to the Roman Empire, despite being a human being with limitations. He questions why a machine would despise another machine, whose springs facilitate its action, implying that individuals, whether seen as machines or not, can still contribute positively to society. He continues this analogy, arguing that good people are just like springs that support society's tendencies towards happiness, while the wicked are like ill-formed springs that disrupt the order, progress, and harmony of society. He suggests that society rewards the good for their utility, while punishing the wicked for their uselessness or for the harm that they cause. In the next section, he argues that the world and all beings within it, including a hypothetical God, act necessarily according to inherent properties, and that this premise challenges the usefulness of religion as a means of influencing the courses of events. The world, including all beings in it, is itself a necessary agent, meaning that everything in the world acts in accordance with the causes and properties inherent in its nature. This suggests that beings in the world cannot act otherwise than they do, as their actions are determined by the same causes and properties that govern them. He further argues that even if God exists, God would not be considered a free agent. He posits that if there were a God, God's manner of acting would be necessarily determined by the properties inherent in God's nature, and nothing would be able to arrest or alter God's will. This implies that even God's actions would be predetermined and not subject to change. Based on these premises, Dolbach suggests that actions, prayers, or sacrifices, and any other religious rituals of humans would not be able to suspend or change God's invariable conduct and immutable design, rendering all religion useless. It implies that if everything in the world, including God, acts necessarily according to inherent properties, then human actions or religious practices would have no impact on altering the predetermined course of events. In the final section of this selection, Dolbach questions the idea of human freedom in the context of divine omnipotence and providence, suggesting that if religious people believe in the complete dependence of man on God for existence, preservation, and actions, then true human freedom becomes a contradictory concept. In short, Dolbach argues that according to the hypothesis of religious scholars and theologians, humans cannot be considered truly free. He suggests that if religious people believe that humans are continually dependent on God for their existence and preservation, and that humans' actions and experiences are all effects of divine will and decrees, then humans cannot be considered free. He continues this argument further that if God preserves humans in every moment, even in the moment of sin, then humans are forced to exist by God's will, and thus God is ultimately responsible for humans' ability to sin. By the phrase preserves humans in every moment, he means God is keeping humans and sinners in existence, even in their moments of sinning. This challenges the idea of humans' free will, as human actions are predetermined by God. This wasn't the most difficult reading we've looked at so far, but it is a little bit awkward and repetitive. When he says things like, man is not free in his choice, He is evidently necessitated to choose what he judges most useful and agreeable. He doesn't make it perfectly clear how this is a challenge to our common sense notions of free will, and it takes some work on our parts to kind of reconnect everything, but it's probably good for us mentally. In the end, this was a dense piece. He starts and ends with the argument that if religions are correct, then it is simultaneously required that we have free will, while it is impossible for us to have free will. Then he moves through arguments about environmental factors that limit our free will, like where we were born and who our parents are, then into arguments about our emotional lives and our experience as rational beings, and how our affections and deliberations are equally determined by either external factors or our inborn natures. In his explanation of why free will is an illusion, he sets us up for the next lecture on compatibilism when he asks, "You think yourself free because you do what you will, but are you free to will or not to will, to desire or not to desire? Are not your volitions and desires necessarily excited by objects or qualities totally independent of you?" This will become clearer when we discuss Frankfurt's compatibilism later. Before ending as he started, with the implications of religion, he discusses the permissibility of ascribing moral blame and moral value to beings that are no different from machines. So, yes, it was incredibly dense, but if it were more clearly articulated, I think the argument would have much more persuasive thrust.